Liam, welcome to the show. Always an absolute pleasure. Mystic Liam, you've been calling this for so long. Who would have thought if you tax the producers to the hilt, they'll simply wither away? And that's exactly what's happening, isn't it, Liam?
It is. And look, for all the talk of net zero, for all the talk of renewables now accounting for 40% of our electricity, which they do, when you take into consideration energy for transport as well, oil and gas still account for 70% of our energy requirements. We use a lot less coal than we used to in generating electricity. We use less oil and gas than we used to in generating electricity. But it's still a hugely important part of our energy mix. And of course, until quite recently, the UK was a major exporter of oil and gas because of the North Sea. But in recent years, North Sea production has massively diminished. And it's diminished even more, Martin, since the government introduced taxation, heavy taxation on North Sea oil and gas extraction. It's now 75% of any surpluses that companies make. Those surpluses which are meant to be used to, service their debt, to reinvest in the business, to try and keep it going. Very capital intensive projects. And yet the Tories have taken the oil and gas taxation from 30 to 40% of total profit, all the way up to 75%. And now Labour are saying that's not enough. They're going to introduce, quotes, a proper windfall tax. Well, God knows what that is. 80, 90? Where does it end? Let's have a look at some numbers here, because we've had an excellent report from the Offshore Energies UK group, a group that represents companies who drill in the North Sea and elsewhere. Ross Dornan, their author, who people may remember from my On the Money show, he was off and on the money, hugely knowledgeable young man. He's written this report. It shows 40% of oil and gas used in the UK is now imported, which is a very high share in this world of energy insecurity, when we have obviously rather fraught relations, to say the least, with the Russians, a major energy exporter, and indeed some Middle East countries. 11% of the electricity that we use in the UK is brought in via undersea cables. Again, I'm not saying this will happen, but, when I talk to my friends in the security services, they are worried about undersea electricity cables being sabotaged, and they talk openly about that. Our total oil output in the UK is now just 60% of our domestic demand. That's the lowest ever share of our domestic oil usage accounted for by our own production. So in this world of heightening energy insecurity, we are becoming more and more energy insecure. And the UK's energy production overall is down by 2/3 since the year 2000. That's oil and gas energy production. So that's the report from the Offshore Energies UK group. And I'd say it makes for pretty chilling reading. I'm wondering, Martin, when the government is going to let Rolls-Royce get on with building these small nuclear plants, these modular nuclear reactors that are much, much smaller, can be put together much, much more quickly. We've got a plant being built, a nuclear plant at Hinkley Point. It's way over budget and way overdue. Sizewell C in Suffolk, is that going to happen? We don't know. Nuclear is very, very important as a mix, part of the mix with renewables, because you can use nuclear as baseload when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, which is often in the UK, particularly in the winter when we need energy. And so I would say that what this report highlights, and if anything, it's understated, what it highlights is the extent to which successive governments, this isn't a Tory or Labour thing in particular, it's successive governments have, in my view, completely underplayed the importance of energy security. And nerds like me have been warning for years that this was a problem. And now we have this geopolitical angst with war between Russia and Ukraine. Now we have, increasingly difficult relations with some Middle East countries and indeed with Iran, another major energy exporter. These things really need to come to the fore. We need politicians to talk a lot about what they're doing in this area, Martin, because as many GB News viewers and listeners will know, certainly if they've been listening to me in the years that I've been at GB News, the UK, both households and firms, we pay more for our electricity than pretty much any European country, even though we've got the highest share of renewables, which are meant to be cheap. And it's because we've got the highest share of renewables that we pay so much, because we pay to subsidise those renewables, their production, and we pay to subsidise gas-fired power plants that must remain idle but ready in order to replace renewable energy when it simply isn't there at short notice. So this is a major set of issues, and thank you for letting me explain it, because so few people get time on television to explain this really complex stuff. But let's be clear, Martin, you know, I want us to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. I think we should be using less oil and gas, but we need to be realistic. And politicians need to understand that support across the general public for so-called net zero, which is now being questioned more than ever before, will utterly collapse if we have blackouts. And those blackouts can be pinned on renewables and the big share we have of renewables and the fact that we haven't built the storage capacity for gas, we haven't developed battery technology in order to justify that high level of renewables. It's as if the politicians want to go for the easy win, the virtue signalling of building wind farms and solar power without understanding the technical realities of what you need in place in order to facilitate those renewables. And I must say, in my long discussions with front benchers in all the main parties, very few of them actually understand what I've just said, though I know many GB News viewers and listeners will.